And Charles, we're going to get started off with farming and be talking about the upcoming, can we call them protests next week? But what have you got?
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. Yes, indeed, farming and the recurring themes of funding and food security. But we'll start with a clip from GB News recently, which has been doing the rounds on social media. Patrick Christys interviewing somebody called Jon McTernan, and we'll hear what he says that has caused quite so much outrage.
Well, personally, in favour of doing to farmers want to go on the streets, we can do to them what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners.
So just to be clear, John, you would, beat them up?
No, close them. I mean, this is an industry we could do without.
So, okay, all right, so this got weird. So you would do to farmers what Margaret Thatcher did to miners, which was, she used very heavy-handed police tactics, followed by what? Putting them out of business?
If people are so upset that they want to go on the streets and spray slurry on them, then we don't need the small farmers.
Now, before we examine what it is that he said, let's just look at who Jon McTernan is. And the Institute for Government page here describes him as a senior fellow with extensive experience in government, advising prime ministers around the world. He was Tony Blair's Director of Political Operations. Now, that should give people a clue as to why he said what he did say. And of course, I think the point to be made here is that within the context that he speaks, he is absolutely right. On screen now is a diagram showing all the major players in the food industry in the United Kingdom. And the only reason that they are able to do what they do is because we continue to buy this stuff. So people who are up in arms or opposing the globalist agenda need to consider this aspect of it, probably in slightly more detail, before the comments of people like Jon McTernan can be rejected. Of course, the point he makes is that small farms are indeed entirely dispensable because there are bigger players there who will conform to the model that suits not just their industry, but also the government that is deciding whether or not to work with them. And for people still to be labouring under the misapprehension that the government is there to support small farms, I think need to think again. Now, just by way of a case study, we'll just look at Cargill, one of the big players, actually worldwide, but really an American food business. And I've highlighted the word successful there. They make no mention of the fact that it would be beneficial if the food that was produced was healthy for people, but also for the environment. And just to sort of reinforce that point, the ingredients that they provide the other food producers, they talk about proteins based on wheat and corn, so not actually wheat and corn, and therefore not actually food. As to the type of player that we're dealing with, we go to worldgrain.com, who report in 2023 that they were turning over $177 billion, which is almost equivalent to the budget, the entire year's worth of budget for the National Health Service. That went down for the current fiscal year to about 160 billion. But the point here, or at least the question to ask, is why on earth, given those statistics, would government be paying attention to small farmers rather than these big industry players with their absolutely enormous lobbying capability? So to consider this in light of what's happened on the other side of the Atlantic, there's been much speculation about whether or not there's going to be any kind of pushback against these big corporate players. And we look at the words of Congressman Thomas Massie, who has been touted as perhaps the Secretary of State for Agriculture in the United States. He sent out a tweet in which he says, "I stand ready and willing to help the president with any part of his bold agenda to focus on the health and well-being of Americans. But I have received no commitments or offers from President Trump's team, and any discussion of the transition are premature." Now, the reason I pulled Thomas Massie into this is because he has been going to something called the Road Food Conference for many years. He's tweeted about it here, and he says, "Today I'm coming out of the pantry. I'll be at Joel Salatin's farm in Swoop, Virginia on May 17th and 18th. That was this year. And Joel Salatin, to those of you who follow the UK column interviews, is somebody that I spoke to a couple of months ago here with an interview called Let the Animals Do the Work. And Salatin's philosophy is one in which effectively the sort of the four tenets are all addressed with the same model, in that farming can work well for the business, or at least farming can work as a profitable business. It can work for the community, and it can provide healthy and nutritious food for the consumer, but also benefit the environment. And this is not something that governments typically are choosing to embrace, despite the protestations that they are going down the regenerative agriculture route. Now, all of these will be in the show notes, but in addition to the Salatin interview, there is a range of others from the UK column stable, which indicate exactly how well this can be done. We've got Jon Cook here talking about his raw milk business, dealing directly with the consumer. Angus McIntosh in South Africa doing effectively the same thing whilst regenerating the landscape, as well as Sir Julian Rose, who effectively pioneered many years ago the early organic movement, whilst it was still being done effectively in a sort of legitimate sense. And then more recently, Mark Byford, a Suffolk farmer, who again deals directly with the consumer and arranges his business so that he has a direct relationship with the community. But of course, this is not what Jon McTernan is talking about, and it speaks volumes that he was quite so closely involved with Tony Blair then, and indeed the philosophy not just of Blair, but all those who have been within his orbit over these years. Now, as Mike referenced at the beginning, there have been rumblings in the United Kingdom across the farming community over the course of 2024, which of course has been a very difficult year for farmers, not just because of the weather, but also because of the changing nature of the environmental land management schemes that the government has started and then changed and left a great deal of uncertainty. As Julian Rose says, subsidy creates slaves. Nonetheless, there are a couple of events planned for next Tuesday, the 19th of November in London. So we'll just have a quick look at what those are and hope to resolve some of the confusion that may have arisen. We've got the National Farmers Union describing what is called a mass lobby event, which requires prior contact with your MP if you are a farmer or a grower. And this has been orchestrated by the NFU to meet with their MPs in Parliament, and as they say here, urging them to ask the Chancellor to reconsider the changes to inheritance tax. Of course, I spoke about this last week, the changes to the agricultural property relief. And a point worth making here is that the business property relief was rather sort of left out because there was so much focus on farmers. But of course, this does affect people who run businesses as well. And with so little time to prepare, of course, it is possible to mitigate against this with the 7-year rule. But because this is due to take effect in 2026, there is in effect a point beyond which farmers are left powerless to avoid or at least not incur a tax that was previously not there in their path. So as I say, there's a mass lobby in London on Tuesday the 19th. As well as that, there's due to be a rally. Now, the organisers of each event insist that there's to be effectively sort of cooperation between the two, and that if you are going to the mass lobby event, you can also turn up to the rally. You do need to register to do that, and this seems to be because the Metropolitan Police have either given the organisers the impression, or the organisers have effectively deduced that there are anti-terror considerations here that they need to address. So those are the two events that you can consider going to and supporting. But ultimately, I think the message here is really one of trust. And why on earth should small farmers trust the government? What is it that they really do expect the government to do, given their track record?
Yes. Thank you, Charles, for that. Thank you very much. We'll talk much more about that in Extra.